Trauma, by its very nature, has a profound effect on us all. It can often shape who we are, for better or worse, depending on how you respond to it. And few films explore this with as much nuance and honesty as the Guardians of the Galaxy franchise. See, despite all the laugh-out-loud humor, excellent music, and top-notch production design, the thing that truly sets these movies apart from other blockbusters is
emotional damage.
You see, the Guardians are made up of a thoroughly traumatized batch of individuals, but there's a good reason for that. The purpose of art is to help humanity better understand itself, and almost every character in the Guardians of the Galaxy series has something unique to teach us. That's why today, we'll be examining how a few of these characters have responded to the traumas they've faced throughout life, how successful their coping strategies have been, and how we should implement the emotional lessons they learn throughout the franchise. Let's start things off with the man, the myth, the legend,
StarLord. Who?
Peter Quill has a lot of emotional issues to work through, but they almost all originate from a fear of intimacy. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 1 largely focuses on Peter's struggle to form meaningful connections, and this all stems from the loss of his mother. If we look at the opening scene in which Meredith Quill succumbs to her illness, we get a perfect encapsulation of how Peter avoids having to confront grief. With only moments left to live, Meredith reaches out to her son.
Take my hand.
But Peter refuses. He can't bring himself to connect with his dying mother because that would mean acknowledging his mother's impending death. In order to avoid suffering loss, he shuts himself off from feeling or expressing attachment. And this truly is the core wound that Peter has to overcome in his big screen debut. When we're reintroduced to the character as an adult, he's working alone, with neither friend nor family anywhere in sight. And while solitude isn't inherently a bad thing, in this case, it clearly seems to be an unhealthy choice driven by Peter's fear of intimacy. Just look at the way he introduces himself as StarLord rather than Peter Quill. The manufactured persona is an attempt to keep people at arm's length. They can't get to know the real him if they've only ever met the notorious outlaw. Wait, why does this sound so familiar?
Who's your favorite fearless hero?
Additionally, it's important to examine how Peter interacts with the women in his life. It's established early on that Peter is quite the womanizer.
If I had a black light, the place would look like a Jackson Pollock painting.
So much so, in fact, that he can hardly remember the names of the women he's been with.
Hey,
Reed.
He refuses to form any meaningful connections, romantic or platonic, because the grief of losing his mother is still unresolved. He has shut off the part of himself that feels real love for others, but that love is a key part of being a fully realized human. It's only when circumstances force him to be part of a plucky band of misfits,
don't call us plucky,
that Peter actually begins to overcome his issues. At first, Quill is only comfortable teaming up with Drax, Groot, Rocket, and Gamora because he doesn't care about them. He's looking out for himself, and if anything were to happen to them along the way, it would be no skin off his back. But without realizing it, working together with this ragtag team winds up causing him to invest emotionally in these other people. He begins to form deep relationships with them before his insecurities are able to convince him to self-sabotage and push them away. A big part of this is due to Peter's instincts for leadership. While it originates from a place of ego, StarLord positions himself as the de facto team lead of the Guardians. But a good leader must care about the people he commands. He realizes that the emotional benefit of having people he can really trust far outweighs the risk of possibly losing them. The other major factor is his budding romance with Gamora. Unlike the other girls Peter has lusted after, Gamora doesn't fall for his shallow seduction.
And I am not some story-eyed waif here to succumb to your pelvic sorcery!
This isn't to say that she doesn't have romantic feelings for Peter, but her actions make it clear that she is willing to establish firm boundaries. And if anything romantic does happen between them, it's going to be on her terms. By denying him physical intimacy, the one thing he has used women for up until now, she forces Peter to view her as a person, not an object. Because of this, Peter comes to realize, whether he likes it or not, that his feelings for her run much deeper than just physical attraction. The prolonged platonic stage of their relationship essentially tricks Peter into overcoming his fear of intimacy. I feel like the lesson to take away from Peter's growth in the first film is that loss is a tragic inevitability, and it's easy for that type of trauma to make us only think about how things are going to end. But if you deny yourself experiences because they are finite, you're missing out on the whole point of life itself. Peter was able to overcome his intimacy issues because he was only focusing on the present. He didn't put pressure on what his relationship to the other Guardians would become, he just let it be what it was in that moment. Now, yes, it's true that some of these relationships ended up leading to immense grief. Gamora, the only woman besides his mother he allowed himself to love, died tragically, and much too soon. But I'm sure Peter would agree that even the short time he was able to spend with Gamora was well worth the grief he will live with for the rest of his life. This is also why, at the end of the first film, he's finally able to open up the gift from his mother. While it may be hard to acknowledge the loss he suffered, accepting it allows him to truly appreciate the lingering echoes of his mother's love. The next character I'd like to talk about is Nebula, and the two people at the heart of her trauma are Thanos and Gamora. See, both so-called daughters of Thanos were abducted as young children after their planets were ravaged by the Mad Titan's army. From there, they were gaslit into viewing Thanos as a father figure whose approval they needed to earn. But this shared trauma manifested in wildly different ways for the two sisters. Gamora, being the more capable fighter of the two, quickly gained Thanos' favor. This led to her becoming one of the Mad Titan's preferred instruments of destruction, while Nebula was looked down upon as a failure and disappointment. Now, this is a classic move straight out of the abusive parenting handbook. By pitting Nebula and Gamora against one another, it makes Nebula believe that Gamora is the source of abuse, when in reality, Thanos is the only one to blame. He is incapable of loving either of them, but because Thanos showers more praise upon Gamora, Nebula mistakes her sister for the enemy, and her misplaced desire for the Mad Titan's validation becomes that much more intense. The most messed up part of this all is that it's not like Gamora has it much better. Sure, Thanos puts her through less physical abuse, but because she's the quote-unquote favorite child, Gamora's life is also much more thoroughly controlled. Thanos replaces Nebula's body piece by piece and seems to take pleasure in making her feel worthless. But there's a strange sort of freedom in being seen as the screw-up. Thanos' neglect of Nebula allows her the space to develop her own thoughts and feelings. And while most of the emotions she experiences are different shades of rage, resentment, and depression, they're still hers to experience. To be clear, I'm by no means trying to say that her flavor of trauma is more desirable or easier to deal with than Gamora's. I'm simply trying to point out that Nebula mistakenly believes that Thanos' favor is a prize to be won, when in reality, it's a unique but comparable form of abuse all its own. Now, because Gamora is so focused on protecting herself and betraying Thanos, she was never able to give comfort or guidance to Nebula. However, it's unreasonable to expect that from her, seeing as she was also a victim of Thanos. And Nebula finally realizes this after her failed attempt to kill her sister in Volume 2. It's only when the two are alone together and able to express their feelings that Nebula and Gamora start to understand what the other was forced to endure. In recognizing the validity of both their experiences, they realize the common factor was Thanos. Thanos all along. They were never each other's enemy, he was, but his manipulation and abuse drove a wedge between them and prevented the sisters from uniting against their shared abuser. In a dark but beautiful moment of things coming full circle, Nebula and Gamora's final interaction is when Gamora gives up the location of the Soul Stone in order to stop Thanos from ripping Nebula apart. And while yes, this does ultimately lead to half of all life being wiped out, it's a deeply impactful moment where the two sisters assert that they will no longer be the source of each other's pain. They've truly become a united front in opposition of the Mad Titan. But it's also important to realize just how lucky it is that they've come to this realization at all. Avengers Endgame gives us a crystal clear look at how things could have been different. The 2014 version of Nebula is still desperately seeking out her father's approval. Even modern Nebula's attempts to change her mind can't keep her 2014 version from doing whatever it takes to please Thanos. And this compulsion to win the Mad Titan's approval quite literally destroys her in the end. In a weirdly dark yet poetic turn of events, Nebula has to kill the version of herself that she used to be in order to become a fully realized version of the person she now is. The big takeaway from Nebula's story is that identifying the source of trauma is just as important, if not more so, than identifying the trauma itself. If you're not able to do that, it's incredibly difficult to overcome that trauma, and incredibly easy to make it worse and hurt people that are completely innocent. Speaking of which, let's move on to Gamora. Given that every aspect of her existence was shaped by what Thanos wanted her to be, Gamora is incredibly closed off emotionally when we first meet her in Volume 1. Even when she first asserts her independence by betraying Thanos, she does so with the cold and calculated indifference that the Mad Titan drilled into her. It's only after joining the Guardians, who give her the freedom to be her own person, that she starts to express emotions and develop her unique sense of self. Her relationship with Peter exemplifies this growth particularly well. In Volume 1, there's definitely an unconventional chemistry between the deadliest woman in the galaxy and the galaxy's biggest goofball. But even so, neither of them are emotionally developed enough to have a healthy romantic relationship. Up until now, having emotions of her own was a luxury she wasn't afforded. There was only what her father felt, what her father wanted. Even if she might be feeling affection for Peter, she doesn't have the emotional bandwidth to make sense of those feelings, much less act on them. Just look once more at how she rejects StarLord's attempt at seduction.
I know who you are, Peter Quill, and I am not some starry-eyed waif here to succumb to your pelvic sorcery!
It doesn't address whether or not she reciprocates his interest, only that his pursuit of her is a distraction from her ultimate goal, betray Thanos. In Volume 2, after truly establishing her independence, we start to see more of her personality develop, especially when it comes to her dynamic with Peter. We see that the two have developed a really wholesome friendship, and even if she starts off by denying that she has romantic feelings for him,
Sorry if it seemed like I was flirting with the High Priestess.
I don't care if you are.
she is now capable of discussing the concept of romance. Looking specifically at the screenplay, when the two dance together on Planet Ego, Gunn writes, "This is definitely not the first time they've done this," which I think really encapsulates the nature of the unspoken thing between the two of them. Even if Gamora isn't in a place to admit the feelings she has for him,
If you ever tell anyone about this, I will kill you.
she obviously has allowed herself to be more vulnerable with Peter than anyone else in her life. She deeply values the relationship they are building, but in her mind, defining it would mean giving up a great deal of control, which is fair. I've said it before, but truly loving another person is one of the most courageous acts of vulnerability a person can partake in. It means that a part of you becomes thoroughly intertwined with a person you don't control. Their happiness is your joy, but so too is their grief your sorrow. The walls put up around Gamora's heart might isolate her, but there is also comfort in that solitude. Additionally, up until now, the only love love, she is known, is that of an abusive father figure and homicidal sister. In her mind, applying the L word to her relationship with Peter would risk inviting that type of toxicity back into her life. By the time Volume 2 ends, Gamora is still only able to go so far as admitting
It's just some unspoken thing.
but despite not putting a name to it, she no longer seems to be denying the feelings altogether. Sadly, the last time we see this Gamora is in Avengers Infinity War, and her interactions with Peter in this film really show just how deeply rooted the trauma inflicted upon her by Thanos is. This is the movie where Peter and Gamora finally act on their feelings for one another, but the circumstances that led to this are deeply disturbing. When Gamora learns that Thanos is close to collecting all 6 Infinity Stones, she asks Quill to end her life if necessary, in order to prevent Thanos from learning what she knows. And after Peter reluctantly promises to do so, she kisses him. Now, the reason this is so tragic is because it shows that Thanos so thoroughly informs how she can express and receive love. She only shows Peter physical affection after he promises to sacrifice her life if the mission demands it, just like Thanos winds up doing. Furthermore, the one time she says,
I love you more than anything.
is seconds before she believes Peter is about to shoot her. But despite how depressing her story arc in the Infinity Saga winds up being, there is one small bit of solace given to audiences. As the Mad Titan makes ready to sacrifice her in order to attain the Soul Stone, Gamora resolutely declares,
This isn't love.
Gamora knows for a fact, regardless of what Thanos or even an Infinity Stone might think, that real love isn't throwing your daughter off a cliff. It's being surrounded by people that you care about and that care about you. It's making amends with family, and it's dancing with the person that makes you happier than anyone else. Despite everything Thanos put Gamora through, she broke free of him and experienced a type of love, a real love, that he never will. For this next section, I'd like to look at a specific moment from Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, and what it represents for the characters involved. After discussing the benefits of being ugly, Drax tells Mantis,
Those pools, they remind me of a time when I took my daughter through the forgotten lakes of my homeworld. She was like you,
These guys sting.
innocent.
Drax then looks blankly into the distance, appearing not to feel any emotion at all. But the moment Mantis touches his arm, she bursts into tears. The reason I adore this moment is because it really shows just how differently people express emotions, especially when they're related to traumatic events. Drax's blunt attitude and inability to comprehend metaphors
Nothing goes over my head. My reflexes are too fast.
makes it all too easy to assume he's simple-minded or doesn't feel the full spectrum of emotions. But as Mantis's reaction shows us, Drax feels things just as intensely as the rest of us. His stoic attitude just makes it harder to identify. Just listen to how he describes seeing his wife for the first time.
My Ovid. I knew immediately she was the one for me. The most melodic song in the world could be playing. She wouldn't even tap her foot. One might assume she was dead.
Even though it's played for laughs, we're able to see that his love for his wife is every bit as intense and valid as the romance between StarLord and Gamora. And by the same logic, his grief at losing not only his partner, but his child as well, easily equates to, if not surpasses, the devastation Peter feels after losing Gamora. People often gauge the severity of someone's trauma by how they react to it, or more specifically, how they visibly react to it. People like Drax, who express themselves in a muted or stoic manner, often get overlooked, even though their trauma is every bit as valid as someone else's. What's worse is many people who express themselves in this manner do it because they're worried about being a burden to others, and therefore double down on this approach when they see people overlooking their emotional needs. It's an awful feedback loop that's really easy to enter into and almost impossible to get out of. It often takes someone like Mantis, who is particularly empathetic, to be able to see through a person's stoic demeanor. And even when they do so, it's not always about offering up a solution for what that person is feeling. We see in this sequence that Mantis doesn't really say anything to him, and instead just sits there, feeling his sadness alongside him. In many cases, emotions aren't a problem to be solved, but rather an experience to be validated. Mantis recognizing Drax's feelings on a level no one else ever has is far more meaningful than if she tried to offer up a quick fix to make him happier. Speaking of Mantis, her particular emotional issues stem from how she was raised. Like so many MCU characters, Mantis was brought up by a narcissistic father figure. Ego took advantage of her empathic nature and used her as a tool for his own benefit. Her sole purpose was to regulate Ego's emotions, which meant that, like Gamora, she was never allowed to have feelings of her own. Her arc in Volume 2 centers around her breaking free of Ego's narcissistic abuse and gaining a level of independence. And the thing that allows her to achieve this is empathizing with the Guardians. By using her abilities on people besides Ego, she comes to understand how real and valid other people's emotions are. This is why immediately after sharing the aforementioned moment with Drax, she's desperate to tell him about Ego's evil intentions. Ego had previously manipulated her into believing only his thoughts, feelings, and goals matter. But once she's confronted with the truth that other people's emotions not only exist but matter, she can no longer be a servant of Ego. The final step in this journey comes during the Guardians of the Galaxy holiday special. It's revealed that Mantis is likely the biological daughter of Ego, making her half-siblings with StarLord, but doesn't want to tell Peter because she's worried it might make him upset. She's so worried about someone else's emotions that she hides a core part of her identity. When she finally works up the courage to tell him, Peter is overjoyed to have a sister.
That's the greatest Christmas gift I could ever get.
What this reaction essentially does is show Mantis her inherent value as an individual and makes her realize she shouldn't hide who she is. She matters just as much as everyone else. This dedication to nuanced character development and honest depictions of emotional trauma is really what sets the Guardians of the Galaxy above any of its peers. Even the most stubborn holdouts that claim the MCU isn't cinema really don't have a leg to stand on when it comes to the work of James Gunn. If you think I'm forgetting about Rocket, don't you worry. I'm just waiting till Volume 3 releases so I can give him the in-depth analysis he deserves. And if you like psychological deep dives on movie characters, check out my breakdown of Adonis and Rocky's journey through the Creed films. I'm Dylan, and this has been The Writer's Block.